The G pawn cannot be hidden from that G8 square. And Magnus cannot believe it. He's so mad at himself.
Wow, you never see this. The players set up for potentially the final game of the Chess.com Classic if Alireza fails to win. Once again.
We've got one d4 on the board. So Alireza sticking to what he did earlier on in the match in game 2. And it did work, right? To some extent, we did have the chaos on the board. We did have an absolute wild outcome of the opening with eventual sacrifices being played and Alireza getting his chance. So he's going to try that one more time, but this is slightly different.
Yeah, no London system. This time he managed to make it over the Rubicon, putting the bishop on g5. The problem, Tanya, is that the conventional approach here is to put a queen on f3 and then to trade twice on f6. And that is a terrible approach in a must-win game because that leads to a very drawish endgame that's been studied to the dregs, so to speak. So Alireza pausing here saying, wait a second, I just got the memo. I need to win this game. How do I avoid an early endgame? Maybe he forgot about this option by Magnus. There are alternatives to queen f3, right? You can play knight f3, but it's not considered to be a good idea in the Carlsbad to allow Black's bishop to move up to f5. If you want to play a Carlsbad with teeth, then you should have played the move queen to c2 here to prevent bishop f5. Once you've played e3, it's really, really hard to avoid an endgame. Yeah. Without getting a toothless middle game. Alireza is thinking, and we know exactly why. Whoops. Whoops, whoops, whoops. What do you do?
I think he's thinking a move too late. Daniel, what are the chances of him actually mixing this up early on in the opening? Because knight f3 really is the way to go. You cannot allow Black to get that bishop out to f5 controlling this diagonal unless you've got some sort of a prep, some sort of an idea up your sleeve. Or what I've been saying is all wrong. And this is the great idea that Alireza had for his must-win game. Putting the knight on e2, potentially heading over to g3.
Yeah, I mean, he's just trying to get a position. If we could pull up an analysis board, I think some people in the chat will already find this to be familiar. But what I was talking about, the main line is queen f3, bishop g6, and bishop takes f6. But this triggers an early queen exchange. This is a great line to play if you want to minimize your risk and play for a small advantage for white. This has been studied since the 90s, and Magnus is not going to lose this position with Black. I mean, he knows this very well. This is exactly up his alley. So Alireza was just spending some time trying to find a way to avoid the theory. He's come up with knight e2, but this smells. This doesn't seem like the kind of thing he wanted to get. Magnus is a very comfortable position now. Bishop to d6. Looks good. Knight b to d7. And a big problem, Tanya, is that if white completes the knight maneuver, if white plays knight to g3, the bishop on h4 is going to be like, well, what about me? There might be no bishop on h4 because of the threat of g7, g5. So this knight on e2 is really, really awkward. And I'm interested to see how Alireza solves all of these problems in the next couple moves. And maybe bishop f2?
I like bishop f2 because eventually the dream is to put the knight on g3 and try to get an e4 break in. You want to get your central pawns moving. So the bishop from f2 is really nicely placed, covering up the king a little bit, but also defending that d4 pawn, overprotecting the center for a future break. And I think Alireza is doing the right thing. He knows that he just can't play a normal strategic fight, a normal Carlsbad game, and expect to outplay Magnus Carlsen in that. He wants to get him out of any kind of theoretical preparation, any familiar territory. And again, just hit the random button. Just get a random position on the board where both have a chance, both have the opportunity to go wrong. We see knight g3 played. And Daniel, I won't be surprised if we do see a light squared bishop being traded off. But for now, the b2 pawn comes under fire.
I was going to say, I wouldn't be surprised to see an a4, rook a3 sighting somewhere there, but Alireza deciding to adopt a more conventional opening approach. Queen b6 is a really annoying move. That is an annoying move because queen to d2 is a necessary response. Again, you're avoiding the queen trade like the plague if you're Alireza Firouzja, but you also don't want to play e4 prematurely because then your center can collapse. Magnus could throw in the move c6, c5 at some point. So I'm really skeptical about Alireza's chances in the early going. Magnus is preparing bishop f8, making this e4 advance as hard as possible. Alireza basically needs a big miscalculation, a misjudgment, maybe a premature c5 by Magnus Carlsen. But the way that this game is going, the trend of the game seems to be favoring Carlsen.
And he's keeping up the speed. He's keeping up. There are no weaknesses in Black's camp. It's the ball. The ball is in Alireza's court. He's the one who has to create his chances in this one. Magnus needs only a draw to get his 8th tournament victory in a row. He's on a hot streak, win after win, not just on the games, but tournaments as well. And Daniel, I think Alireza is going to need a lot to stop Magnus right now, especially given the opening outcome. We've got, whoa, chaos button hit. E4 on the board, White's king still in the center, Magnus's rook already lined up. This feels like it shouldn't work. It's a bit too early.
Well, the blue arrow is not my arrow. That's the engine arrow. Obviously, Alireza wants to play E5, and that would trap the knight. But Magnus is so good at reacting to these types of impulsive moves. I like this choice by Alireza. I think this is the best thing that he can do. But Magnus trying to poke holes in Alireza's approach C5, a double question mark assigned by the engine. Now, let's all calm down for a second. I'm not convinced that C5 is a bad move. And the blue arrow is showing E5, Tanya. If we could put this on the board, E5, why can't Black just play C takes D4? And how do you even make sense of this? Apparently, after bishop takes D4, bishop C5 runs into this very, very nasty trick, knight to A4. But the fact that the eval bar is jumping up and down tells me that I wouldn't put too much stock in the evaluation just yet. Let's see how this unfolds. And let's see if Alireza has the guts to push E5 in Magnus's face.
Well, if you don't push E5, it's kind of hard to come up with an alternative. Do you have time to go shut castle? Because Black is threatening to anyway take on D4 and go in with that bishop to C5. With a king on G1, that just makes Black's life even easier. I think Alireza has to go for it. He's played E4, you say E4, you say E5. Well, not in every position, but in this one.
The best move, according to the engine, the best move is now rook a8. The best move on the previous move, I was going to say, was rook a to d8. Apparently, Black should still play rook a d8 and just leave this knight on pre on f6, because the thing for people to understand is that oftentimes a minor piece is sacrificed in a position like this, because usually you get at least 2 pawns, and you get massive pressure in the center. So it's not unprecedented to sacrifice a piece. But Magnus's whole approach of moving first and calculating later, Alireza just called BS on that, and for good reason. Magnus can't, he plays C5, and he just got caught with his pants down. He stepped out of the shower, and now he's blundering a knight.
And the knight has no squares. You have to give it away. You don't have an option. Everything's controlled. The G4 square, the H5 square, the D5 square, the E4 square. You can run nowhere with that knight. So Magnus has to figure out what's the best way to actually give it up. And when you need only a draw to wrap up a match victory, this is really not the kind of position you want to play, even if you have enough compensation. Even if the eval bar says that Black's got stuff to fight for because White's king is in the center, you don't want to have to prove compensation for an entire piece.
And I'll tell you exactly what Magnus missed. If we could pull up an analysis board, let me just show the same line I showed earlier. I think Magnus, in the back of his mind, had C takes D4 planned, bishop D4, bishop C5. Now, if White plays bishop takes C5, this works like a charm. This shows us exactly why this line can be so dangerous for White. Knight D3 and White's position collapses, you get checkmated. The problem is knight C3 to A4. These knight moves to the side of the board are very easy to miss, and they're a blind spot even for players like Magnus Carlsen. Why is knight A4 so good? Because if the queen just kind of casually drops back, well, at the very least, you could just trade everything on C5 and take on F6. And Black is starting to run out of pieces, much like Magnus did in their first game where he sacked a minor piece. Black just doesn't have the offensive firepower to punish White's king in the center. Let's see what happens. C takes D4 is on the board. Alireza recaptures with the bishop, and we might get exactly this line. Doesn't mean Magnus is going to lose the game, but he's in big trouble here, at least objectively speaking, giving Alireza exactly what he wants. A chaotic position where Alireza is also winning on the board. That kind of helps.
But it's exactly the kind of position where mistakes can happen from either side, and Alireza still needs to be precise. He has to win this one. So bishop C5 on the board,
easy
knight
clap.
A4, all done, and Magnus immediately blitzes at the move, queen to C6. So maybe slightly better than the C7 square that you pointed out, Daniel, because it does eye the knight on A4. But what does this change? Is it actually the G2 pawn rather than the knight on A4?
Yeah, this was the easy part. Knight a4 was the easy part. Now the hard part for Alireza is figuring out these complications. In particular, you have to decide, are you taking on c5 first, or are you immediately snagging the knight on f6? I think the former option is better. But what would scare me personally is bishop takes c5, rook takes e5. There's pressure down the e file. Again, Magnus currently material is equal, but Magnus can try to snag 1 or 2 pawns for the minor piece, and the conversion process, one way or the other, is going to be epically hard. We know how Magnus is just unbeatable. You can have more pieces on the board than he does, and somehow his pieces seem to count for more. It's like when Lionel Messi is on the soccer pitch. It's like one player is worth 5. So let's not count the chicks until they've hatched for Alireza. Right now, he's got to decide which knight he captures. That's a really, really hard call. Tanya, also rook c1 is a candidate move. This ain't easy.
He's playing Magnus Carlsen. It was never going to be easy. But I think he has to pick up one of the knights. And he chooses the wrong one, apparently. I want to point out one thing. My first instinct was to take that pawn on g2. But actually, you have no threats. White can pick up the other knight as well, because the rook on h1 is defended by that knight on g3. So queen takes pawn doesn't work. Daniel, you're pointing out another idea. And I just want to say that's not the most natural move for me after giving up the
engine.
knight.
The engine was pointing it. I was pointing it out after the engine. I'm like, Newton inventing calculus after Leibniz. Miss Stockfish, the Leibniz. Rook a d8 apparently is the best move with knight to e6, right? The only move more difficult to spot than knight moves to the side of the board are retreating knight moves. So apparently rook a d8 is just going to reclaim the minor piece, but Alireza probably spent the majority of the time calculating knight d3 check, which is the most tempting move in the position. At least for me, I would go knight d3 in a bullet game and then probably resign after king f1. And this is why I'm commentating the Chess.com Classic, and Magnus is playing it. And Magnus might not be playing it for much longer because he's just found rook a to d8.
He just finds the best move every single time. How do you fight against the guy? How do you beat a guy who not only converts winning positions flawlessly, but also defends difficult, tactically crazy positions to perfection? Rook d8 on the board. Magnus is down a piece, but Alireza's king in the center. There are 2 deadly pins here. The rook from e8 pins the bishop on e2. The rook from d8 pins the bishop on d4. It's hard to come up with a move. Knight e6 that you pointed out is a massive threat. Knight d3 check comes in with even more power now because the d4 bishop will be hanging.
Yeah, this is a classic example of tunnel vision at the highest level. You're fixated on figuring out the complications after knight d3, and just kidding, April Fools, May Fools, the knight actually heads back to e6. And it's just bad luck for Alireza that this bishop in the center of the board, surrounded by friendly forces, cannot be protected a second time. Another piece of bad luck is that you need to castle. Like, you can't afford to keep your king in the center. Alireza has to find a way to complicate the game. I would recommend bishop f3 and maybe knight g3 back to e2. But this is heading toward a draw, and that would be the worst piece of news for Firouzja. I don't see a way for him to avoid, Tanya, a total liquidation in the center, which would essentially spell a peaceful result and defeat. Queen d6, I guess? Yes.
Very nice. Just triple down on that bishop on d4. There's really no fighting this pin anymore. The one idea that I see is you take on g7, try to take on h6. Is that something to hope for? But queen takes bishop comes in with a check.
Yeah, and then that knight entrenches itself in the center. Alireza could try to pick up the loose pieces on b7, on g7, but at the end of the day, look at the way that Carlsen has centralized his pieces. I'm not seeing it, Tanya. I mean, maybe knight e2 can be tried, but this is heading toward a draw, inevitably. E takes f6. That was the big miss.
Takes on g7. Magnus trades off the queen. I see that wasn't the most accurate way to go ahead, but it is such a human way to play. You want to trade off the pieces, also defend that h6 pawn, making sure the queen doesn't come into any attack. You're giving up b7, but Daniel, can the rook line up against the bishop trying to pick up the b2 pawn? Rook b8?
Well, by the way, hats off to Alireza. He paused there, didn't panic, and I think found the best way to keep this game complicated. It's not over. There's still plenty of chess left to be played. And I think Alireza should snag this pawn on b7. The problem is that if black plays rook b8, the bishop slides back to d5, Tanya. The pawn on f7 is going to be hanging. And let's not forget, after bishop takes b7, black is down 2 pawns. Maybe Magnus is putting his eggs in the knight e2 check basket, trying to get piggies on the 7th, both rooks lined up on the 2nd rank. But there's still going to be some defending to do for Magnus if Alireza can gather the cojones to take on b7.
When you're in a match situation that Alireza is in, I think that gives you a lot of confidence to play moves like this because you know you have to go for it. You can't just play KG chess. You've got no choice at all. So you throw everything that you've got at your opponent. I am expecting bishop takes pawn, but Daniel, he needs to start making his decisions quick because even if he ends up with an advantage, he needs time on the clock to be able to convert it.
I think the move that's causing him to think is knight h5, which is tempting because you're heading to f6, but it doesn't work. Magnus can simply take on f3, move his rook away from the line of fire of the knight, and then slide his bishop up to g6. Great call by Firouzja. It's still game on. Bishop takes b7 on the board. The eval bar still believes that white has a chance. And most importantly, if you look at this with your own eyes, white is up 2 pawns. If black takes on g7 prematurely, that allows the white knight to jump into f6. A potential rook on e2 is not the end of the world for white. You could bring the rook up to f2 and challenge it. I love the way that Alireza is handling this stage of the game, making it as difficult for Magnus as possible. I still think this one will end in a draw, but white's in the driver's seat here. I mean, Magnus can win 1 pawn back, and he very likely will, Tanya, but Alireza's got the 2-on-1 on the queen side. He's got some winning chances here.
And that's a massive extra pawn on the queen side, right? Because that light squared bishop actually defends that queening square. So it's going to be a big assist to that passer, which will eventually be created with these 2 pawns moving up the board. And the other bad news for black here is, yes, you can double up on 7th heaven, get your rook to d2, start attacking the pawns, but that bishop on b7 really nicely defends that g2 pawn. So you don't even really care. You can first push that rook out, continue with the idea of going a4. That bishop on b7 is the crowning glory in white's position.
Yep. And apparently the top engine move here is rook e2 to b2, using this temporary alignment of the pawn on b4 and the bishop on b7, because you do have this one button that you can press, a7, a5. But that button can only be pressed if you're x-raying the b pawn from behind. Magnus is the kind of guy who would pause for 3 minutes and then find rook b2 and a5. I've played him enough times to know that that's on his radar. He starts with king takes g7, totally reasonable, just eliminate the pawn. But I really, really like, Tanya, this prospect of rook to b2. What did I say?
You know him well. You know Magnus Carlsen well. It is on the board. He finds it, so he's stopping any further pawn advances for just the time being. Also, that rook from d8 can join the activity. Also, an idea always to watch out for is that bishop from h7 sliding into play. I'm trying to find a square, and I was thinking bishop to b1, threatening a mate in 1 in some positions. Daniel, bishop b1, rook d1 check coming in. Just watch out for these ideas.
And how poetic would it be if we saw that move given bishop to b8 in the previous game? It would be so funny if we saw bishop b1, bishop a2. I would, this is why Magnus is Magnus. I would just play these moves because I couldn't resist the aesthetic appeal of making this maneuver 2 games in a row. But, good call, Tanya. It's on the board.
And you have to watch out because rook d1 is a massive threat. Rook d4 would walk into a checkmate in 1. And Daniel, you were talking about pattern recognition. And I think the fact that Magnus played out this exact same idea with the white pieces definitely helped him find this. And I think he saw this when he played rook to b2. This was on his radar right then.
And I think, just to be serious, bishop a2 is not the point. The point is to keep the white rook shut out of the game so that when you play a move like rook d2, white just has stagnation on the queen side. Because how does Alireza win this game? The only way Alireza wins this game is by converting his 2-on-1 advantage on the queen side into a pass pawn. But how does he do that? He can play b5, but then he's never going to be able to play a5. Magnus has him dead to rights here, and he's also setting up king f6. This is not moving in the right direction for Alireza Firouzja. He needs a big turnaround here, and we're just so used to Magnus playing perfectly in endgames that I think we're not giving Alireza enough of a chance here, but with 40 seconds on the clock, I just don't see this working out for him.
And you can feel the momentum shifting over the last few moves, right? Rook to b2, bishop to b1. Now the king is moving forward, coming on to e5 to destabilize. That rook on f4. All of
Yeah.
black's pieces are so active. You get the feeling that Magnus magically, once again, with the Magnus touch, has managed to create the counterplay in the endgame. I'm going to call on the
Bishop
prophet
e4.
here. The prophet
Bishop
Daniel
e4.
Naroditsky. Does Alireza manage to convert this one? Yes or no, Daniel?
No.
The prophet has spoken.
No, because it's a drawn position. He's got 10 seconds on his clock. And Magnus, f5, bishop e4, as always, finding all of the key moves. Rook h5 check. Great chance by Alireza. King f4 would have gotten checkmated in one move, by the way, to g3. And now Alireza wins the second pawn. Listen, hats off to Firouzja for the way that he's handled the task here. Unfortunately, Magnus's rooks are way too active, and it's not even really white playing for the win here. It's actually black playing for the win.
Checkmate in one. Checkmate in one coming in.
Magnus is now winning.
Oh.
I think he can play e3. Yes, e3 is winning for black. But if Magnus wants a draw, which is all he needs, he can also choose to double on the second rank.
These are the last few
he's
moments.
Losing! Rook g3. Oh my gosh.
What just happened? He missed it. Magnus Carlsen reacts. He missed this resource.
No,
he cannot believe it. Look at him.
Oh my gosh, I jinxed him. And rook to g3. Why is that so scary? Not only does it stop rook g2, but now the g-pawn is free to move about the cabin. The seatbelt sign has come off.
And Magnus can't believe it.
I cannot believe it either. We will be in our commentator chairs for a little bit longer. It's now just dead loss for black, or is it? Magnus needs to find some way to convert that e-pawn into something tangible. This is insane.
And Daniel, you're going to tell us how. What did he miss once this is over? Because moves are coming in fast and quick right now.
How do you win this, though?
He offers a rook trade.
He won another money move. Another money move. Rookie won by Firouzja. Magnus has no moves here, and the g-pawn is going to promote. Alireza is going to win. No freaking way.
It's coming in. It's only the clock. He's got 6 seconds on the clock. He has to do this. Can Alireza do the impossible? Can he come back from this position? G6, Daniel.
Miss rook g3.
Unbelievable.
Oh my gosh.
He's frozen.
30 seconds. He's got no moves. He has no moves. E2, not possible. Rook e2, rook trade, lost. Alireza's next move is g6. Firouzja would win this with 1 second left. Magnus doesn't have a way even to make this interesting. He doesn't have a way to set a trap. This is resignable. And I take responsibility for this.
If Alireza wins this, it goes into Armageddon. Rooks have been traded off. White's king comes closer towards the e-pawn. You could also go back to g1, but I think he wants to put that king on e1, just making sure the e-pawn's under control, and the h-pawn, the g-pawn coming together.
King d3. King d3 has to be tried. Magnus still trying. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn and king f1.
It's rook.
It's winning. That's it. That's it.
Oh my gosh.
The king.
Armageddon incoming. The king goes to f3. It hides. The g-pawn cannot be hidden from that g8 square. And Magnus cannot believe it. He's so mad at himself.
Wow, you never see this. You never see. Oh, and Magnus is furious. Magnus is furious, and he should be, because this is just not something you ever see from him. Absolute hats off. Round of applause for Alireza Firouzja. He was the only one in the room who did not give up.